It was an ordinary afternoon, and the sky was beginning to cloud over with the promise of rain. A kind-hearted black man, dressed simply and minding his own business, noticed a woman walking briskly toward the entrance of a cafe. She looked hurried, juggling her phone in one hand and a bag in the other. Without thinking twice, he quickened his pace and reached the door just in time to hold it open for her. It was a small gesture, one most people would hardly think twice about. But to him, it was a natural reflex, just being polite, helping someone who seemed to need it. She barely glanced at him. In fact, her reaction was far from grateful. With a sharp look of disdain, the woman, white, sharply dressed, and obviously well off, muttered something under her breath. Her lips curled into a sneer, and she shot him a look that stung worse than any word she could have said. She didn't even say thank you. Instead, it was as if his act of kindness was something she felt disgusted by, something beneath her. He stood there for a moment, stunned. His hand still held the door, even though she had already walked past him, as if he didn't exist. A mix of emotions crossed his face: confusion, hurt, maybe even a bit of anger, but he quickly pushed it aside. He'd experienced this kind of treatment before, though it never stopped feeling wrong. He let the door close behind him, taking a deep breath, before he too entered the cafe. As he waited in line for his coffee, the scene replayed in his mind. How could something as simple as holding a door turn into such an uncomfortable moment? He wasn't looking for praise or attention, just common courtesy, a smile maybe, or a simple thank you. But the woman had treated him like he was invisible, or worse, like his kindness was unwanted because of who he was. He noticed her again, sitting at a table near the window, staring at her phone. Her face was a picture of someone who felt far above the world around her, untouched by the little acts of kindness, or the people who offered them. For a second, he thought about confronting her, asking why she had reacted the way she did. But what good would that do? It wasn't worth the trouble. So, he took his coffee and walked out, shaking off the encounter as best as he could. Days passed, and the incident slowly faded from his mind. Life carried on as usual. But little did either of them know, fate had other plans. It was a few days later, and the woman was driving through the city, her mind wandering. She barely noticed when her car began to make a strange noise. It started as a small rattle, but soon turned into something far more worrying. Before she could react, her car jerked and sputtered to a stop, right in the middle of a busy intersection. Panic set in. She was stranded, with cars honking behind her, and drivers throwing frustrated glances her way. She tried restarting the engine, but nothing happened. Her phone's battery was nearly dead, and she had no idea what to do. Just when it felt like things couldn't get any worse, she saw someone approaching from the sidewalk. Her heart sank. It was same man, one she had brushed off at the cafe, the one she had treated so poorly. And now, here he was, walking toward her car. As the woman sat in her car, frozen by a mix of frustration and embarrassment, she couldn't believe what was happening. Of all people, it had to be him, the man she had barely acknowledged days ago, the man whose kindness she had dismissed without a second thought. And now, in her moment of need, he was walking straight toward her. She felt a flush of panic rise up inside her. What could she say? Should she pretend she didn't recognize him? Should she apologize? Her mind raced, but she couldn't seem to find a way out of the awkwardness that was about to unfold. He approached the car with the same calm, unbothered demeanor he'd had the day at the cafe. He didn't seem angry, nor did he appear smug, as if enjoying her discomfort. Instead, there was a quiet patience in his expression, like someone who understood that people make mistakes, but still chose to offer help when needed. Without saying a word, he motioned toward the hood of her car, asking with a simple glance if she needed assistance. Caught off guard, she hesitated, but after a moment she nodded, feeling a strange knot in her throat. She rolled down her window slightly, her voice cracking as she spoke. I think something's wrong with my car," she said, trying to mask her embarrassment. It just stopped in the middle of the road. He didn't respond verbally at first, just gave a small nod and gestured for her to pop the hood. She did as he asked, watching nervously as he bent over the front of the car, inspecting the engine with the care and attention of someone who knew what they were doing. The seconds ticked by, and she felt her heart racing, not just from the car trouble, but from the tension of the situation. How could she face him after how she'd treated him? As he worked, her mind drifted back to that moment at the cafe. She had been in such a rush that day, stressed out by work and a million other things, and she hadn't even thought about the man who had opened the door for her. In her world, people didn't really stop to acknowledge one another. They just moved from one task to the next, always focused on their own problems. But now, sitting in her broken-down car, she realized how different this man was. He wasn't like the others who had driven past her without a second glance. He was helping her, despite the fact that she had shown him nothing but coldness. After a few minutes, he stood up and wiped his hands on his jeans, giving her a quick update. "Looks like your battery might be dead," he said, his voice calm and measured. "I can try to give you a jump if you have cables." Her cheeks flushed with embarrassment again. Of course, she didn't have jumper cables. She had never thought about needing something like that. I don't, she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. He didn't seem surprised. With a slight nod, he reached into his own car, parked nearby, and pulled out a set of jumper cables. As he worked to hook them up, she watched him closely, wondering how he could be so composed, so kind, after how she had treated him. She couldn't help but feel a growing sense of shame. Why had she acted the way she did? What had made her so dismissive of him that day? The questions swirled in her mind, but she didn't have any answers. As the car roared back to life after the jump start, she felt a wave of relief. But that relief was quickly replaced by guilt. He had helped her, gone out of his way to get her car running again, and she still hadn't even properly thanked him. She rolled down the window a bit more, trying to find the right words. "Thank you," she said, her voice softer than before. "I really appreciate it." He looked at her for a moment, his expression unreadable. Then, with a small nod, he said, "No problem. Just be careful next time." Before she could say anything else, he walked back to his car and got inside. The engine rumbled as he prepared to drive away, leaving her sitting there, still stunned by what had just happened. She watched him in her rearview mirror as he pulled away from the intersection, disappearing down the road, and she couldn't help but feel like she had missed an opportunity. Not just to thank him properly, but to maybe explain herself. To acknowledge that she had been wrong. Over the next few days, the encounter played on repeat in her head. She couldn't shake the feeling that there was something more to this man, something she hadn't taken the time to see. She began to feel a strange sense of regret, not just for how she had acted, but for the assumptions she had made about him, and perhaps about other people in her life as well. Her mind kept returning to that look he had given her at the cafe. The way he had stood there holding the door, his expression open and kind, only to be met with her cold indifference. Why had she been so quick to judge him? Was it because he didn't look like someone who belonged in her world? Or was it something deeper, something uncomfortable that she didn't want to admit to herself? One evening, as she sat alone at home, scrolling through her phone aimlessly, she came across an article that caught her attention. It was a story about a local man, someone who had grown up in a tough part of the city, but who had spent years volunteering, helping others, and making a difference in the community. The article featured a photo, and to her shock, it was him, the man who had opened the door for her, the man who had helped her with her car. Her breath caught in her throat as she read more. He was well known in the community, not for any flashy accomplishments, but for the quiet, consistent way he helped people. Whether it was organizing food drives or mentoring young kids who were struggling, he had earned the respect and admiration of those around him. The article described him as someone who always showed up, someone who didn't ask for recognition, but simply believed in doing what was right. She sat back in her chair, her mind racing. How could she have been so blind? She had written him off as someone beneath her, someone unworthy of her attention or respect, and yet here he was, someone who had likely done more good in his life than she ever had. The weight of her own judgment pressed down on her, and she realized how shallow she had been. For the first time in a long time, she felt a deep sense of shame, not just for how she had treated him, but for the way she had been living her life. Always in a rush, always focused on herself, never really stopping to see the people around her. She had been so quick to judge him, without ever knowing his story, his struggles, or his heart. She knew she had to make things right, but she wasn't sure how. Should she try to find him and apologize? Would he even care? The questions gnawed at her, leaving her restless and uncertain. Days turned into weeks, and the memory of that day stayed with her, a constant reminder of the kind of person she didn't want to be anymore. She started to look at the world differently, noticing the small acts of kindness that she had once ignored. The barista, who always smiled when handing her coffee, the janitor who kept the office clean without ever being acknowledged, the strangers who held doors open for one another without expecting anything in return. The next time she found herself at that same cafe, she hesitated at the door. For a moment, she thought about how easily she could fall back into her old habits, rushing past people, not stopping to notice or appreciate the little things. But then she remembered him, the man who had held the door for her with a kindness she hadn't deserved. With a deep breath, she pushed open the door and walked inside, determined to be different this time. She didn't know if she would ever see him again, but she hoped that somehow he knew his kindness hadn't been in vain. Weeks passed, but the encounter with the kind man lingered in her mind, growing heavier with each passing day. Every time she found herself in a cafe or driving through the city, she would catch herself glancing at faces, wondering if she might see him again. But no matter how many times she looked, he was nowhere to be found. Her life continued as it always had: work, meetings, errands, but something had shifted inside her. The things that once seemed important now felt shallow. She noticed how often she moved through the world with blinders on, focused only on herself, and it left her feeling empty. The memory of how easily she had dismissed him, how easily she had assumed she knew everything about him just from his appearance, gnawed at her. One evening, as she was out running errands, she found herself driving through a part of town she normally avoided. The streets were different here, quieter, older, a bit worn down, but there was a sense of community she had never noticed before. People walked by with casual waves to one another, kids played in the nearby park, and neighbors stood talking on their porches. It was the kind of place that felt worlds apart from the one she usually occupied. Her car slowed as she passed a small community center, the building simple but well maintained, with a group of people gathered outside. Something about the scene caught her attention: a familiar figure standing at the edge of the crowd. It was him. Her heart raced as she recognized the man who had helped her, the one she had dismissed so thoughtlessly. She pulled over without thinking, her hands trembling slightly as she turned off the engine. She sat there for a moment, watching from the car, unsure of what to do. Should she get out and approach him? What would she even say? An apology seemed so inadequate now, after all this time. And yet she couldn't just drive away. Not again. Gathering her courage, she stepped out of the car and began walking toward the group. As she got closer, she could see that they were setting up for some kind of event. There were tables with food, boxes of supplies, and a small group of volunteers moving about, preparing everything. He was in the middle of it all, quietly directing things with that same calm, unhurried demeanor. Her steps faltered as she approached, unsure if he would even remember her. But as she drew closer, their eyes met, and she saw a flicker of recognition in his expression. It wasn't anger or resentment, just a quiet acknowledgement, as if he had known all along that she would find her way back here. For a moment, neither of them spoke. She stood there feeling more exposed than she had in a long time, unsure of how to begin. The noise of the busy street and the chatter of the volunteers seemed to fade into the background as she struggled to find the right words. I didn't expect to see you here, she finally managed, her voice quieter than she had intended. He smiled, just a small, patient smile, and nodded. This is where I spend most of my time, he said simply, his tone easy and unbothered, as though the tension that had been weighing on her all these weeks didn't exist for him. She swallowed hard, feeling the weight of everything she hadn't said pressing down on her. I've been meaning to say thank you, she continued, her voice shaking slightly, for helping me with my car that day. And for the door. I know I didn't act like it, but I was grateful. I was just, I don't know, I was in a bad place, and He held up a hand, cutting her off gently. You don't have to explain, he said. I've seen a lot of people in a lot of different places in their lives. We all have bad days. His words were so calm, so understanding, that they made her feel even worse. How could he be so forgiving when she had treated him so poorly? The shame that had been building inside her for weeks threatened to overwhelm her, and for a moment she thought about walking away, about leaving this whole uncomfortable encounter behind. But something stopped her. Maybe it was the look in his eyes, patient, kind, and open, or maybe it was the sense that this was her chance to make things right. "I'm sorry," she said, the words tumbling out before she could stop them. "I judged you. I didn't even give you a second thought that day, and I felt awful about it ever since." He was quiet for a moment, studying her face. Then he nodded slowly. "We all make mistakes," he said, his voice soft but firm. "What matters is what we do after." His words hung in the air between them, heavy with meaning. She knew he was right, but that didn't make the shame any easier to bear. She had spent so much of her life rushing through it, not really seeing the people around her, not really caring. And now, standing here in front of him, she realized how much she had missed, how many opportunities for connection, for kindness, had passed her by because she had been too focused on herself. Before she could say anything else, a voice called out from the group of volunteers. "Hey, we could use some help over here." He turned to look, then back at her, his expression easy and open. "You want to help?" he asked, the question simple, but somehow it felt like more than that. It felt like an invitation to do something different, to be someone different. She hesitated for only a moment before nodding. "Yeah," she said, feeling a strange mix of nerves and relief. "I'd like that." He smiled again, and this time, it felt like the weight she had been carrying for weeks began to lift, just a little. The evening passed in a blur of activity, setting up tables, arranging food, greeting people as they arrived for the event. She worked quietly alongside him, watching as he interacted with everyone, offering a smile here, a kind word there. It was clear that he was well known and well loved in this community. And as the evening went on, she began to understand why. He wasn't just kind, he was present. He took the time to see people, to listen to them, and to help where he could, without asking for anything in return. As the sun began to set, and the event wound down, she found herself sitting on the edge of one of the tables, watching as the last few people trickled out. Her muscles ached from the work, but it was a good kind of ache, the kind that came from doing something meaningful. He came over and sat down beside her, his gaze on the fading light in the sky. For a moment, they sat in comfortable silence, the weight of the earlier tension gone, replaced by a quiet understanding. "You've got a good heart," he said after a while, his voice soft but sincere. "You just need to give yourself the chance to show it." She blinked, surprised by his words. It wasn't the kind of thing she was used to hearing, and for a moment, she didn't know how to respond. But as she looked at him, she realized that he wasn't just talking about today. He was talking about everything, the way she had lived her life, the way she had been too quick to judge, too quick to move past the small moments that really mattered. "I think I'm starting to figure that out," she said, her voice just as soft. They sat there for a while longer, the air between them quiet but full of unspoken understanding. She didn't know what would happen next, or how things might change for her after this night. But for the first time in a long time, she felt like she was on the right path. The feeling of suspense that had been building in her chest all these weeks wasn't gone, but it had shifted. It was no longer a weight of guilt or shame, but something different, something hopeful, like the possibility of change hanging just out of reach, waiting for her to take the next step. As they sat there, enjoying the last traces of sunlight, she felt a sense of calm she hadn't experienced in a long time. The weight of her earlier regrets seemed to ease, replaced by a quiet hope. For the first time, in what felt like forever, she believed that she could be different, that maybe she wasn't defined by her past mistakes. She looked over at him, still amazed by how naturally he had accepted her apology and allowed her into his world, even after she had wronged him. It felt like the beginning of something new. But just as that peace began to settle in, her phone buzzed. She glanced down at the screen and felt her stomach drop. It was a message from work, urgent, as always. Her boss was demanding she come in first thing tomorrow for a meeting she hadn't been told about until now. Her peaceful moment evaporated, replaced by a familiar surge of anxiety. She had been avoiding her boss for weeks, ever since the stress at work had started pushing her to her limits. It had been easier to bury herself in other distractions, but now, with this message, reality came crashing back. She sighed, putting her phone down. He noticed the change in her demeanor immediately, his calm eyes studying her with concern. "Everything okay?" he asked, though his tone suggested he already knew it wasn't. She hesitated, unsure how much to share. "It's just work," she said, her voice tense. "It's complicated." He didn't press her, just waited patiently, like he knew she needed a moment to sort through her thoughts. The silence stretched between them, but it wasn't uncomfortable. If anything, it gave her space to breathe, to think about what had really been weighing on her all these weeks, not just her guilt over how she had treated him, but the bigger picture of her life, the pressure she had been under. "I've been struggling," she admitted finally, her voice quieter than before. "Work's been a nightmare. It feels like everything is spiraling, like I'm constantly chasing something I can never catch." She paused, trying to find the right words. "I don't know if I'm doing the right thing anymore. I thought I had everything figured out, career, goals, all of it. But lately, it's like nothing feels right." He didn't respond right away, just nodded slowly, his gaze thoughtful. "Sometimes, the things we think matter the most don't hold up when we start looking at what really makes us happy," he said gently. "It's easy to get caught up in the race, but that doesn't mean it's the right race to run." His words hit her harder than she expected. She had spent so much of her life focused on climbing the ladder, chasing success, believing that once she reached a certain level, everything would fall into place. But now, sitting here, surrounded by people who seemed to live so differently, she was starting to wonder if she had been chasing the wrong things all along. Before she could respond, her phone buzzed again, and this time, her face tightened as she read the message. The meeting wasn't just about work, it was about a deal she had been working on for months, one that could either make or break her position at the company. Her boss was demanding updates she wasn't prepared to give. Panic clawed at her chest. She wasn't ready for this, and the thought of facing it made her feel like the walls were closing in. "I should go," she said suddenly, standing up too quickly, her voice sharper than she intended. "I've got a lot to deal with." She didn't want to leave, but the weight of her responsibilities had crashed back over her, and it was suffocating. He stood too, his expression concerned but not surprised. "Do what you need to do," he said, his tone still calm, but there was a hint of something else in his eyes, disappointment maybe, or a quiet understanding that this was a battle she wasn't ready to face just yet. She nodded, avoiding his gaze, feeling a mix of guilt and frustration welling up inside her. She had just started to feel like things were shifting, like she was on the verge of something new, but now it all felt like it was slipping away, swallowed up by the demands of her old life. As she walked back to her car, she couldn't shake the feeling that she was leaving something important behind. She drove home in silence, her mind racing with thoughts of work, the man she had just reconnected with, and the unsettling realization that maybe everything she had built her life around wasn't as solid as she had once believed. The next morning, she arrived at the office early, her nerves buzzing as she prepared for the meeting. She tried to push the thoughts of last night out of her mind, but they lingered like a shadow she couldn't shake. As the meeting dragged on, filled with tense conversations about numbers and projections, she realized how disconnected she felt from it all. The very things she had once poured her energy into now felt hollow, meaningless. And yet, she couldn't bring herself to walk away. Not yet. Just as the meeting was wrapping up, her phone buzzed again, and she glanced down at it distractedly. But when she saw the message, her heart stopped. It was from a number she didn't recognize, but words sent a chill through her. "I know who you really are." Her breath caught in her throat. She stared at the screen, her mind racing. What did that mean? Was it someone from work? Someone who knew about her struggles? Panic surged through her, and she quickly excused herself from meeting, stepping out into the hallway to gather her thoughts. She stared at message again, her fingers trembling as she tried to make sense of it. Who could have sent this? And what did they know? She felt her chest tighten, with a mix of fear and confusion. Was this about her job? Her recent mistakes? Or worse, was it connected to the man from the cafe, the one who had helped her twice now? She thought back to their conversations, to the way he had looked at her, as if he could see right through her defenses. Could he be involved? No, it didn't make sense. He had been nothing but kind. But the timing of it all, the way everything seemed to be colliding at once, made her feel like she was standing on the edge of something much bigger, something she didn't fully understand. The next few days passed in a blur. The message haunted her, gnawing at the edges of her thoughts, no matter how hard she tried to focus on work. Every time her phone buzzed, her heart skipped a beat, but there were no follow-ups, no clues as to who had sent it or what they wanted. The tension built inside her, winding tighter with each passing hour, until it felt like she was ready to snap. One night, unable to sleep, she found herself driving aimlessly through the city, the quiet hum of the car, the only thing keeping her grounded. She didn't know where she was going, but somehow, she ended up back near the community center, the same place where she had seen him last. She parked her car and sat there for a long time, staring at the building, half hoping she would see him again, half dreading what it might mean if she did. The message had shaken her, and she didn't know who to trust. Everything felt uncertain now. Eventually, she got out of the car and walked slowly toward the center. The place was empty, this late at night, but she could still feel the echoes of the community that had gathered here, the sense of warmth, of connection. It was so different from her world, where everything felt cold and transactional. She stood there for a while, lost in thought, until she heard footsteps behind her. Her heart leaped into her throat, and she spun around, her pulse racing. There, standing in the shadows, was the man she had been thinking about all night. He stepped forward, his expression unreadable. "I didn't expect to see you here," he said, his voice low and calm, but there was something different in his tone this time, something that made her feel uneasy. She took a step back, her mind flashing to the message she had received. "What are you doing here?" she asked, trying to keep her voice steady. He didn't answer right away, just looked at her with that same calm patience that had once comforted her, but now felt strangely ominous. "I think it's time we had a real conversation," he said, his voice quiet but firm. The weight of his words hung in the air, and for the first time, she wasn't sure if she could trust him. Her heart raced as she took a step back, her mind reeling from unexpected tension between them. There was something in his voice that sent a chill through her, something that hinted at knowledge, something he hadn't told her before. She stood there trying to steady her breath, trying to push away the nagging thought that maybe this man wasn't as kind as she had assumed. "What do you mean, a real conversation?" she asked, her voice shaky but determined. She had to know what was going on, especially after receiving that cryptic message earlier. There had to be a connection between the two, between him and the mysterious text. But why now? Why had he come here, in the middle of the night, to confront her? He stepped closer, his face half lit by the dim streetlight, casting long shadows over his features. For the first time, she noticed how deeply his eyes searched hers, as if he were looking for something buried within her. The calmness in his demeanor was still there, but it felt layered now with something else, something darker, harder to define. "Sit down," he said, his tone quiet but firm. He gestured to the bench next to them, and despite every instinct telling her to turn and run, she sat. The events of the past few weeks had already shaken her to her core, but now she was on the edge of something she couldn't ignore. "I'm not who you think I am," he said, his words cutting through the still night air. "I've been waiting for this moment for a long time, actually." Her eyes widened, her pulse quickening. "What are you talking about?" she asked, struggling to keep her voice steady. "Who are you, really?" He exhaled slowly, his gaze lingering on the ground for a moment before he looked back at her. "I've been trying to help people like you. People who are lost, who are caught up in the wrong things. People who don't see what they've become until it's too late." She frowned, confusion swirling inside her. "What do you mean?" She stopped mid-sentence. The words she had been about to say sounded empty in her own ears. She wasn't lost. Was she? She had been trying to make a difference, trying to fix things after everything that had happened. But suddenly, the ground beneath her felt unsteady, like it was shifting beneath her feet. "I've seen the kind of person you've been," he continued. "How quick you are to judge, how you push people away before they can hurt you. I see the way you've been running from your own life, your responsibilities, your mistakes." He paused for a beat, his expression unreadable. "I've been where you are." She opened her mouth to protest, but no words came out. The weight of his words hung between them, suffocating her, forcing her to confront something she hadn't been willing to acknowledge before. She had been running. Running from the guilt, from the pressure of her job, from the mistakes she had made. And now, here he was, telling her things she wasn't ready to hear. "I know who you really are," he added softly. "The message you got, that was me." She froze, her heart thudding wildly. The world around her seemed to tilt, her mind struggling to piece it all together. "You sent the text?" He nodded, his eyes not leaving hers. "It wasn't meant to scare you. It was meant to make you see. I had to make you stop and confront the truth about yourself." Her head spun as she tried to process everything he had just said. She felt betrayed, but at the same time, she understood why he had done it. He wasn't trying to harm her, he was trying to wake her up. "Why?" she finally whispered, her voice barely audible. "Why did you go through all of this? What do you want from me?" He looked at her, with an expression she couldn't quite place, compassionate but distant, like he knew something she still hadn't figured out. "I don't want anything from you," he said. "But I need you to understand that you can't keep running from who you are. You have a choice." His words were like a punch to the gut. A choice. For weeks, she had been grappling with the idea of change, of whether she could really make a difference in her life. But this was different. He was telling her that her choices had consequences, that she had to confront the truth before she could move forward. She felt the weight of everything she had been avoiding crashing down on her, her job, her relationships, her actions. She had been living in a world where everything was surface level, where her success had defined her, and where she had convinced herself that the pain she carried was just part of the process. But now, she saw that it was more than that. It was part of who she had become. There was a long pause as the two of them sat in silence, the tension thick in the air. She felt as if the ground beneath her was slipping away, but at the same time, she was starting to see something new. Something she hadn't been able to see before. Finally, she spoke, her voice hoarse with emotion. "I don't know if I can do this." He looked at her with a strange mix of sadness and hope. "You don't have to do it alone," he said softly. "But you have to start somewhere. This is the moment, whether you like it or not." Her mind raced, but it was no longer with fear. It was with clarity, an understanding that whatever came next, she couldn't keep hiding. The life she had built, the persona she had carefully crafted for herself, was crumbling before her eyes. But for the first time, she wasn't scared. Just as she opened her mouth to speak, something unexpected happened. From the corner of her eye, she saw a figure emerge from the shadows, walking toward them. She blinked, her mind still struggling to catch up, and as the figure got closer, her breath caught in her throat. It was him, her boss, the one who had been sending her constant work messages, the one she had been avoiding. And now, here he was, standing before them with a look of fury in his eyes. "You," he snapped, his voice low and dangerous, "need to leave." Now, her heart dropped. The shock of seeing him here, of all places, was enough to make her go cold. The man who had been her boss, who had been pressuring her for weeks, demanding more and more from her, was now standing in front of her, with anger written all over his face. He turned to the man who had been sitting beside her, his eyes narrowing. "I don't know who you are, but you're going to regret this." For the first time, the kind man who had been so patient with her shifted. His expression darkened, and there was an air of finality to his words. "You're the one who's going to regret this," he said quietly. "You've pushed her far enough." Before either of them could say another word, the tension escalated. The situation that had been building for weeks, the strained work relationships, the guilt, the unexpected message, was now unraveling before her eyes in a way she couldn't have predicted. And then, just as the two men seemed ready to explode in a confrontation, something else happened. Her phone buzzed again. This time, it wasn't a message, it was a call. She glanced at the screen, and her heart dropped even further. It was from her company's legal department. "Are you sure you're ready for what comes next?" The voice on the other end asked. In that moment, everything fell into place. And everything she thought she knew about the situation, about the kind man, about her boss, about her own life, was about to be shattered. The call on her phone echoed through the tension-filled night. She felt a wave of dizziness sweep over her as the voice on the other end continued, calm and distant, but with an undercurrent of something sinister. "Are you sure you're ready for what comes next?" it asked again. Her hands trembled as she clutched the phone tightly. She could hear the tension in the room, the way the air between the two men had shifted. The kind man, who had been so patient, now stood tall and unwavering, while her boss, the one who had harassed her for weeks, was still glaring, his face red with fury. "Hello?" she finally managed to say, her voice shaky. "Yes, it's me," the voice on the other end replied. "It's about the deal. You've been handling sensitive information for the company, and we've got a problem. A big one." Her stomach knotted as she realized this wasn't just about her job anymore. This was something bigger, something that could completely unravel everything she had built. She had no idea what kind of danger she was facing, but she felt the gravity of the moment, the weight of decisions made long before this night. Her boss's eyes shifted between her and the kind man who stood by her side. "What's going on?" he demanded, his voice sharp, demanding answers. "What did you get yourself into?" The kind man's voice cut through the chaos, calm but firm. "She's in more danger than you realize. And so are you." Her boss scoffed, but there was a flicker of doubt in his eyes. "What are you talking about?" The kind man stepped forward, his posture relaxed, but the tension in his eyes spoke volumes. "The deal she's been working on, it's not just about numbers. It's about people, about power. You've both been playing a dangerous game. But what you don't realize is that the stakes are higher than either of you can handle." For a moment, the three of them were locked in a tense silence. The night felt colder now, as if the world had paused, holding its breath, waiting for the next words to fall. She glanced between her boss and the kind man, her mind racing. She had trusted both of them, in their own ways. Her boss had pushed her, sure, but that was just how the corporate world worked. And the kind man, well, he had been the only one who had shown her any real kindness lately. But now, in this moment, everything felt like it was collapsing around her. Her guilt, her regrets, the messages, and the hidden truths, all of it was coming to a head. "I don't understand," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "What are you talking about? What's really going on?" Her boss was silent for a moment, his lips pressed into a thin line. "You need to stay out of this," he finally said, his voice low. "This has nothing to do with you. You've made enough mistakes already. Just go home." Her heart pounded in her chest. His words, meant to brush her off, felt more like a threat now. This was it. The moment she had been avoiding was here. Her choices, the ones she had been running from, were finally catching up with her. The kind man stepped closer, his voice softer now, but laced with an urgency she hadn't seen in him before. "No, this isn't just about you or him. It's about something bigger, something that's been going on for a long time." He glanced at her boss. "You know exactly what I mean. Don't play dumb." Her boss's face twisted in anger. "Don't you dare accuse me of—" But the kind man cut him off, his gaze hardening. "I'm not accusing you. I'm telling you, the deal you've been pushing, it's not what you think. There are people behind the scenes who will stop at nothing to get what they want. And you're just a pawn in their game." For the first time, her boss looked visibly shaken. His eyes flickered with uncertainty, and he took a step back, his bravado faltering. She could see it now, the cracks in his mask, the cracks in the world she thought she knew. The kind man looked back at her, his voice gentle. "You're in danger because you've been involved in something you didn't fully understand. But you're not alone, and you don't have to be afraid. We can fix this, but only if we act fast." She felt a rush of emotion, fear, confusion, and something else, something she couldn't quite put into words. She had been running from everything, hiding from her own failures and mistakes. But now, for the first time, she felt like she could see the truth. "Who are you?" she asked softly, her voice trembling with a mixture of fear and curiosity. He took a deep breath, his eyes meeting hers. "I'm someone who knows how this world works. And I know how to take down the people who are playing with lives like pawns. I've been doing it for a long time." Her boss scoffed, but there was no conviction in his voice now. He seemed lost, like he didn't know who to trust anymore. "And you expect me to believe you?" He spat. "You expect me to just—" The kind man raised his hand, cutting him off. "Believe what you want. But I'm telling you the truth. There's a bigger picture here than you realize. And if you don't help, if you don't come clean, you'll lose everything." Her boss hesitated, clearly caught between two sides, between the corporate empire he had built and the reality of the situation that was rapidly slipping away from his control. She could see it in his eyes now. He was scared. But the kind man, standing beside her, was no longer just a kind stranger. He was someone who had a plan, someone who knew how to get out of this mess. He wasn't just trying to protect her, he was trying to protect both of them from something much larger than they could have imagined. "I need to know everything," she said, her voice steady for the first time. "Tell me what's really going on." The kind man exhaled slowly, his expression grave. He glanced at her boss once more, before turning back to her, as if weighing how much he could reveal. Then, finally, he spoke. "This isn't just a corporate deal," he said. "There are people who are using this to funnel money into illegal operations. The deal you've been working on is a front for something much worse. They've been manipulating both of you from behind the scenes, pulling the strings. They know everything about your moves. They've been watching you." Her mind was reeling. The world she had thought was just about spreadsheets and business deals was collapsing before her eyes. This wasn't just a bad day at the office. This was life or death. "And now they want to shut you down," he continued, his voice lower. "They want to make sure you don't expose them. That's why they've been trying to scare you, trying to push you into mistakes." The message you received? It wasn't a warning. It was a threat. Her boss looked like he was about to say something, but the kind man didn't give him a chance. "They don't care about you," he said harshly. "They only care about protecting their interests. If you don't take action now, you're both done. The only way out is to expose them before they silence you." For the first time, her boss seemed to understand the gravity of what was happening. His face went pale, and the bravado he had worn so confidently earlier crumbled into uncertainty. He was no longer the man who had been barking orders at her all those months now. He was just another victim in a game he couldn't control. She swallowed, feeling the weight of it all pressing down on her. She looked from her boss to the kind man, her heart pounding in her chest. This was it. There was no going back now. "I need to know what we're going to do," she said, her voice steady. "Tell me how we fix this." The kind man turned to her, his eyes serious. "First, we need to make sure you're safe. Then, we take everything we have on them and expose it to the authorities. We can't do it alone, but we'll get it done. And once it's over, you'll be free." As the weight of his words settled into her mind, she felt a strange sense of clarity. For the first time in months, she could see a way forward, a way out of the mess she had created. But just as she was about to speak, there was a sudden sound behind them, a door creaking open. She turned quickly, her heart racing. It was the security guard from the building, an old man who had worked there for years. He stepped out into the night, his expression confused, as if he had no idea what was going on. "Is everything all right?" he asked, his voice shaky. For a moment, everything stopped. The kind man and her boss both turned toward the guard, and in that instant, the night seemed to shift. She realized with a jolt that the guard had seen everything. And suddenly, the stakes were even higher than before. The kind man's eyes widened in recognition. He stepped forward, his expression tense. "We need to go," he said, his voice low and urgent. "This is more dangerous than I thought." But it was too late. The sound of footsteps echoed in the distance, and from the shadows, figures began to emerge, their faces obscured by darkness. The final twist had come, and this time there would be no turning back. The kind man stepped between her and the approaching figures, his body tense, ready to fight. "Get ready," he whispered, his voice filled with determination. Everything was about to change.